If we are going to grow a lot more food, where will the water come from? How will we manage to restore the soils to maintain yields? And for me, one of the big things, and we'll come back to this towards the end, is climate change, because at the moment agriculture and food contribute about 30% of all greenhouse gases. And what has happened over the last 50 years is we have increasingly concentrated agriculture on relatively small number of crops. Three crops account for about 2/3 of the world's calories. 8 crops account for about 85% of the world's calories. And those crops are mainly grown Midwest, Latin America, Northwest Europe, rice over here, in China as well, and palm oil. We have an intense geographic concentration in a relatively small number of places. And if something were to happen to destroy or prevent world trade, then we get in a situation that every country in the world depends on the movement of these commodity crops for its own food security. So that, I think, is a risk. As we move ahead, we broadly have 2 strategies for increasing food. The first one is we can grow more per unit area, which is intensification. And the second one is that we can grow the area, which is extensification, but it requires land use change. If we are going to intensify, we can look back and see, well, we've had a whole range of new technologies, and everybody can picture a bit of farmland and say, well, it's changed over the last 20 or 30 years. Center pivot irrigation, relatively new irrigation technology, a way of maintaining yields. You just have effectively a hose pipe in a circle that goes round and round, dripping water onto the crops, allowing it to grow. Now, Almeria is an example of non-field agriculture, but it's really important agriculture for Northwest Europe. This is a time series of the growth. All of these white areas, as we run through, are greenhouses, or plastic houses, growing essentially tomatoes for Northwest Europe. And you can see the intensification of this land use over time, that we have gone from having relatively low greenhouse density to very high greenhouse density. And if you go there, it's just white all the way across. This intensification, whether in field or whether in technology, applies also to the oceans. This is in China, looking at the growth of fish farms. All of these kind of squarey bits, rectangular bits, are fish farms going out into the ocean. From beginning, so this is 1984, up to 2016, you can see huge intensification. But the issue is, into the future, if we are going to grow more food, what do we do to make this sustainable, given we only have a limited land area? If we want more tomatoes, do we have to resort to growing more and more tomatoes and taking over our agricultural land? How do we do it?
So you've heard from Professor Benton about the intensification of agriculture as one response to the food crisis. And you might think, well, the other thing we can do is extend agriculture and open up new lands as a way of producing new food. The bad news is that when you do that and convert tropical forests to other uses, you can actually have a negative impact on food security. And I'm going to talk about basically 2 ways that that can happen. Imagine a farm plot and an adjacent forest has all of the pollinators, the bats, the bees, the birds that pollinate the crops. It also provides shade, fodder for livestock, wind breaks, lots of local benefits. But also at the landscape scale, forested watersheds for water catchments to water irrigation. And Brazil provides a very good example of how this can happen at the continental scale. So we're going to look at some very interesting Landsat imagery. This is satellite-based data down to a level of 30 meter squares, the picture's taken. Brazil actually pioneered the use of this satellite data for forest monitoring. These red areas are where you see permanent forest cover change from forest to non-forest, that it was gradually eating away at the forest frontier, with the concern that that conveyor belt of moist air would be disrupted and cause drought in agricultural areas. We're going to zoom in briefly just to give you a sense of how the patterns of deforestation have historically taken place. It's an area in Rondônia that shows a classic, what they call a fishbone pattern of deforestation, where the first incursions are a set of road networks that are gradually filled in with agricultural plots. And this is mostly for globally traded food commodities, soybeans and beef. But this is actually a good news story, because Brazil has done an amazing job of decreasing its deforestation rate. In fact, the question is, how did they do it? Well, one way that they did it was doing a better job of monitoring this forest cover loss that created an awareness of the problem, political will, and also agricultural intensification, so that soy and beef production could continue to rise, but by intensifying on the same area rather than opening new areas. But what I want to point out is that they also did it through empowering local forest stewards. This area is sort of a keyhole-shaped area inside this polygon. This is an area in the Xingu River Basin, which is a complex of 20 indigenous territories and about 10 conservation units, where the Brazilian government recognized these indigenous territories and the role of the indigenous peoples in managing this forest. So this is an example of a boundary that you can see from space. You know, it's not a paper park, it's a real entity that can, as you can see, control the forest conversion. And in fact, we have research that shows where there's presence of indigenous peoples all over the world, that's where you have forests left. So this is an approach that I think has applicability around the world. Few people realize how important deforestation is as a source of the emissions that cause climate change. Standing forests are a safe and natural carbon capture and storage technology. They're pulling carbon out of the air and sequester them in the surface vegetation and into the soil. When you deforest, all of that carbon goes up into the atmosphere. If tropical deforestation were a country, it would rank number 3 after China and the United States. That's how significant this issue is. And Brazil's success in reducing its deforestation means that it is number 1 in countries that have reduced emissions that cause climate change. Now, you may have read in the newspaper or directly experienced the catastrophic forest fires that happened in Indonesia in the fall of 2015, and this has happened in previous years since the mid-'80s. And this image actually shows you the fires burning. You can see the point sources of the peat fires burning on the east coast of Sumatra. So this is sort of what it looks like, you know, over time. And these fires have gotten progressively worse as intact forest and peatlands have been disturbed and dried and become more vulnerable to drought events and fire. We're now going to switch to a data layer that shows forest fires at night. It's a good way to see, you know, where the fires are burning. So you can see across the Indonesian archipelago where the fires are. I want to briefly highlight this area right here where you can see sort of literally and figuratively a hot spot. And one of the reasons it's a hot spot is linked to a misguided attempt to improve food security. Back in the late 90s, under the Suharto regime, there was a plan to clear and drain 1 million hectares of peat swamp forest to grow rice. So they brought in the big yellow machines, they dug the canals, they lowered the water table, cleared the forest, opened it up for illegal logging, and then the rice didn't grow because it was agronomically unsuited for the area. Now this is mostly a wasteland area and it burns every time there's a dry season. So that's why you see that hot spot. One concerning factor is how many fires you see across Indonesia. Used to be Papua didn't burn. In 2015, you see actually quite a few fires. And a lot of this is related to new clearing to grow palm oil, which again, a globally traded food commodity. But again, there are some good news stories, and I just want to end on one. Zoom in again to central Kalimantan and show you this area, which you see has been quite impervious to forest cover change. This is a new model of conserving forests called an ecosystem restoration concession. It's something that the Indonesian government has committed to. In fact, they've set up a whole new agency for peatland restoration. This is a private sector driven attempt to have a business model by selling forest carbon credits to provide a revenue stream to protect this peatland area, which is estimated to have, it's only 200,000 hectares, but a full gigaton of carbon. So this is a positive way forward if we can generate forest finance to protect the climate.
I want to talk particularly now about the relationship between food, agriculture and food, and climate change, both causing climate change and climate change impacting upon agriculture and food. And to start off with, we're going to look at a database that comes from the Oxford Martin School, which is looking ahead and saying, if climate change is going to have the impacts that we think it will on global food production, how will this impact upon nutrition and health? And as we run through this time course from 2015 towards the middle of the century, the red dots are excess mortality caused by climate change impacts on diet. And as you can see, huge amounts of impact on food security. And this is not so much access to calories, although in some parts of the world this is important, but it is the fact that vegetables and fruit are perhaps more susceptible to climate change, and as we go ahead, the accessibility of a nutritionally good diet becomes more and more difficult. And even today, under 50% of the world's population is of a healthy weight. Over 50% is malnourished in some form, either too many calories or too few calories. So as we move ahead, if climate change is impacting very much on the way that we grow food, there is potential for there to be very great challenges for our health systems. As we move into the future, the amount of agricultural land that we have is going to decrease. It's going to decrease through urbanization. It is potentially going to decrease because we need to take land for growing forests, for biomass carbon capture and storage, for climate change mitigation, but it's also going to change from sea level rise. And here we have a time course for what we are effectively on course for, around 3 to 4 degrees at the end of the century, even if Paris Agreement is all kind of signed up for. And as you can see, this is Bangladesh up here. A lot of the land just disappears under sea level. Around the world, you can see remarkably large amounts of land disappearing. And of course, this is a threat because the best agricultural land is normally close to a river mouth, somewhere near the coast. Best agricultural land, most fertile, if you think about the Nile Delta, the Mekong Delta, and so on. And it's also the most vulnerable to sea level rise. What I'd like to kind of end up on before my final comment is just the potential of climate change to be a game changer in terms of food production. And this is an interesting animation that goes through from the early 90s up to now, looking at Arctic ice as a proxy of some of the other things that are going on in climate change. Where it is white, this is multi-year, very old ice, typically thick. Where the white disappears, it becomes very thin, new ice, which becomes much more fragile. And as many people know, there is a risk of the Arctic becoming ice-free over the next 20 or 30 years, during the summer months at least. And as you can see, if we compare the beginning and the end, the amount of thick Arctic ice really changes. One of the big things that determines our climate is the oceanic circulations. And one that I'm particularly interested in, which affects Northwest Europe, is the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which effectively drives the Gulf Stream and takes heat from the tropics up towards Europe. As the Arctic ice melts and Greenland ice sheets disappear, you get a lot of fresh water in, which disrupts that current. And over the next 40, 50, 60 years, there is a real chance of that overturning circulation turning off, slowing down and turning off. If that turns off, Europe will have a climate which is much more analogous to Newfoundland or somewhere like that. Our winters will be much deeper. The intertropical convergence zone, which drives the monsoon belt, will drop south. India will lose its monsoons. This part of Africa will desertify, and the Cerrado, which produces a lot of soya, will dry up. If all of those things happen together, we could lose about 30% of the world's food production. And the last food price spike was caused by the loss of about 1/3 of 1% of global calories. If we lose 30% of global calories because our climate change is going unchecked, we could be really in a very dangerous situation. So looking ahead, the challenges for food are not just continuing as we are growing ever more, it is how do we grow sufficient for a healthy life for people to be nutritionally well provisioned and not waste a lot of food. At the moment, only 40% of the world's calories get used for good nutrition. 1/3 of the world's calories are lost and wasted. 1/3 of the world's calories are fed to livestock to produce meat, which is very inefficient. And 1/3 of the world's population eats about 20% calories too much on a daily basis. And that, if you think about it, is a form of waste. So how do we move into the future to deliver a food system that is sustainable, doesn't degrade soils, doesn't deforest, doesn't contribute so much to climate change, yet produces food for all of us? Clearly, we need intensification of our agricultural production to manage that, but it's got to be sustainable intensification. There's a whole scope of technologies that we can use, both in agriculture but also in food. Lots of exciting things going on. but we have to have a transition, a real transformation in our food system to get to the point where we can feed people healthily within our planetary boundaries to maintain the integrity of our planet.